The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. We left off with a really big setup. A setup that was so big that it actually had a setup to the setup. And now is the payoff. Here Berlioz is starting to wrap up his Symphonie Fantastique Movement 1, his big Sonata Allegro, with a joyous, generous restatement of the E-Day fix. And, of course, confirming the key of C. And everything is going to lead back to C. If there's any kind of strange modulation, it'll always come back to C so that the piece can end in C. That's the rules, right? So he's going to obey those rules. Now, when a developing orchestrator looks at a page like this, they have a tendency to just freak out. That defect in our eyes when we look at a grid of black lines on a sheet of white paper. If you put a little dot in the center of each of the cross points, then there is a tendency for those dots to disappear. There is a psychological effect I find sometimes with developing orchestrators when they're studying a big piece of orchestration like this, as if their mind just blocks out certain things. So certain aspects of a page will enter the blind spot until reading vertically becomes more of a developed skill. But it does not have to be that way. You just have to break things down into function, right? And the honest truth is that despite the mass of vertical information here, there really are only about 3 functions, 4 arguably, going on this page. Okay, there is the bass, which is extremely simple. You can just see this long held C and then going to G for 4 bars and then coming back to C and so on. Okay, so that's the bass. And in fact, even the bassoons are really just marginally involved with playing the root in another function that we'll discuss in a minute. And then the next function is harmonizing the melody. It's like this big choral work, right? It's almost as if the orchestra is singing all together and making a big chordal statement. And within that chordal statement, there, of course, is the melody, but in between the melody and the bass, there is a kind of a combined, purely harmonic support, which we see here in the clarinets and the horns, which sometimes becomes part of the bass line, right? Which is just natural. You need to root your chord, which you see here in the C octaves, which would sound down an octave. So this 4th horn would be doubling 1st and 2nd bassoon. And then, of course, all of the pitches in between that and the melody. Some instruments are able to harmonize and follow the melody as it goes upwards and downwards, as we're seeing here, clarinets and oboes and so on, and violas, while others, which don't have as much freedom, are basically just playing the same chord. They're not changing that much of their chord except for those notes that fit into, in this case, the natural horn's scope of pitches. And the same thing is true of the C trumpets. And then, of course, there's the melody. But the melody is not so simple, which this is why I said 3, possibly 4 functions going on here. Because at times, the melody is being harmonized by instruments that play it in other bars, right? So here we see this very simple harmonization in the cellos. But then the cellos start to take the melody at this point. Then there is the sense of decoration happening in the violins as well, which we'll also talk about. So I have not even really discussed in detail anything that is happening with any one particular instrument except for the basses down here. And you can see that a lot of things start to clarify when you think that way, right? What is my mantra? If you don't know it yet, it is texture, balance, and function. Those are the irreducible and yet interdependent elements that are present in any page of scoring, especially orchestral. Of course, the texture is the vertical element. That means everything that is going on at once. And then the balance is whether or not these instruments are balancing with one another. If one instrument is too loud or the other is too soft or whatever, you just really have to work that out. And then the function is, I find, what makes big pages like this instantly readable. After a while, when your reading gets good enough, and you can identify the pitches almost automatically, even of transposing instruments, and just piece it all together in your head as you look at it, then you just start to recognize certain functions running through the music that are easy to identify. So let's start off with the easiest function besides the bass, which we already discussed. We'll talk about the melody. Flutes, bum 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 bum. We recognize that E-day fix. Here it's being played quite furiously, and the rhythmic content is being adjusted to the frenzy of this passage. So we're seeing this being played, as I said before, in octaves with the flute and piccolo. So let's follow the flute and piccolo. Notice that Berlioz pushes his piccolo all the way up to G. But he doesn't want to go any higher than G, right? Here, he drops down to unison doubling with the flutes, and that results in not playing extremely high. I think he wants to avoid the shrillness that occurs from A-flat upwards, which does become quite boxy on the ear. It's almost like getting a Lego brick shoved into your ear to really hear fortissimo piccolo. And although that's become a standard thing nowadays, back then there was probably a sense of taste overriding. They just really did not want that shrillness to be an issue. These are the highest and most identifiable pitches, so that's sort of your baseline. Okay, now if we look at the oboe, we see that sometimes the oboes are playing in unison with the flute, and sometimes dropping down so that they're not going too high, sometimes becoming part of the harmony inside. What's great about this is it allows us really direct bum 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 going to octaves. Then you get this beautiful massive chord right in there with flute and piccolo playing F, and the clarinets F below, and the oboes in the middle playing the harmony inside. And that just gives the most rich sound, which you will hear when we play this page for you. Going onwards, sometimes the first oboe is playing inside, providing an inner harmonic voice, as the piccolo and flute drop down to D, and so does the second oboe. And this actually is a really great combination for first flute because it gives it a little bit more solidity as the line drops a little bit without really overwhelming it. And so on. So you can go through this and identify the exact roles. He pushes his oboe all the way up to E, but he doesn't really want to go much higher than that. He doesn't want to go all the way up to an F, and that's pretty wise, I would say. Unless the oboe is being doubled by the strings, then I would say it would be risky to expose it so much. So right in here, the oboe really essentially becomes part of the harmony. So it's harmonizing from below by a third. And at times, the clarinets become part of the inside voice as well. It's just really carefully crafted wind scoring right in here. Beautifully done, if I might say so. I just so respect Berlioz when I see this kind of scoring. It's extremely carefully worked out. Bassoons are playing harmony. They are covering the bass at times as part of this overall scheme of harmony, which we'll discuss in fuller terms in a minute when we include the horns. So they're not really part of the melody to any great extent. They're just really kind of harmonizing inside what's going on. So you could almost see them right here as more partners with the horns than with the rest of the winds. And of course, that is one of the reasons why it is so much better to have the horns up next to the winds than it is to have them below the trumpets, as we see in scores by, say, Prokofiev, who was trying to reorganize the brass section, which just really didn't work. So oftentimes in this earlier scoring, the horns being next to the bassoons makes a whole lot of sense because they work together in a lot of ways. Let's stay focused on the melody, though, as I promised. Here we have cornets with pistons in G. When you look at this, and just think of everything being down a fourth, right? There really isn't anything about this that couldn't be played by a trombone, especially if it were, say, an alto trombone. Easily can go up to this sounding D, written G. But I think that this is really carefully thought out. I don't think there's anything about Berlioz's scoring where he didn't think it out, try it out, and then make changes according to his obsessive sense of detail, which was pretty amazing, and his craft was just second to none at this point. Even being as young as he was in 1830, he actually did revisions. This will be discussed a little bit more in the intro, but he did revisions after hearing it performed for the first time and made a lot of fixes and made it even better. So my hat's off to him for not abandoning it, but trying to make it as perfect as possible. So in this case, with our G cornets, you have to sort of ask, well, why did he do this? Why did he have this melody line right in here, which is taking place essentially 2 octaves below the flute and oboe? This could be played by chromatic trumpets, because there's nothing here that goes too low. This would be sounding G below middle C, which is perfectly easy to play on a B flat or C trumpet of today, and maybe Berlioz would have scored for those instruments. However, he needed a chromatic instrument. The trumpets of his day were natural trumpets, and that's why you're seeing all these parts of C major chords and G major chords. They really had a limited scope of pitches available. To a degree, the kind of compromising, the sort of cheating that I've pointed out here and there, like for instance this being a B instead of a B flat, that kind of lip correction is a lot easier to do on a horn than it is to do on a trumpet, or at least it would be for back in that day. Or perhaps the horn players would be more accustomed to that, would be a better way of putting it. So trumpet parts in Berlioz tend to be a lot simpler in terms of the natural trumpet, just playing the particular partials that it is given. So he really needs another trumpet-like voice that isn't too big, that isn't as big as a trombone, inside the music right in here to carry that bottom part of this quadruple octave melody. Of course, there is an inside melodic position in between the cornets on the bottom and the oboes and flute and piccolo and so on above it, and that is the violas, which are sort of playing right inside right in here. And then they come back, and of course then the violas become more harmonic essentially, with their lower voice stating the melody. And same thing is happening here with the cellos. The cellos first start off in a sort of a harmonic way, but then they start to play a harmonized melody, with the melody being the lower part of those descending thirds rather than the upper part. When you put all of this together, you get your quadruple octave with a very, very solid bottom to it. That's what is going on with the cornets right in here. So our third and a half, third or fourth function, right, the possible fourth function to our three functions, are these beautiful decorations being played by the violins. So why I sort of include them in the melodic function is that if you just really take a look and see what pitches are being played, G, right, is the same G that's happening here, and then B, C, this essentially functions as a passing tone going from a B to a C to that C that is on this pitch right here, right? And then C dipping down to G, the same G there, and the G reaching up to E, the same E there, and so on. So you can sort of pick throughout all of these really decorative runs by our first and second violins, and you can basically see that it just really follows the melody all the way through, with a few little exceptions, right? Like, for instance, here, we've got starting off on a G, and then running up to this D, and it's actually harmonizing right on this pitch here. And then it finally reaches up to the D almost right at the end, and it does not fulfill itself by going all the way to F sharp, but it walks down to C natural, and then eventually rejoins the melody here with this passing tone going from A to G, right? And then we're back on G and so on. With the exception of a few little spots like that, the violins are really just basically decorating the melody. Here's another spot right in here that sort of avoids exactly playing on those pitches. Now, as you see this, we've got divisi lines for the firsts and the seconds. And if you notice here, the top line of these divisi staves is exactly the same in both parts, and so is the bottom line, right? So the top divisi firsts and seconds are playing exactly the same thing, and the bottom divisi firsts and seconds are playing exactly the same thing as each other, right? So this easily could have been solved by just having the firsts play this line and the seconds play that line, and you would get exactly the same effect. But what Berlioz is achieving here is a very integrated sound. He's having the players sort of play off of each other in these sections right in here within each string group. And then not only do the players play more in sync with each other that way, but also you get the effect of this trading off spread out across the orchestra better, right? So that's just the whole purpose right in here. In some respects, it's a simplification, right? First we have the run up to C in both parts, and by both parts it's always going to mean both groups as well. Then you have the bottom group playing just C and G, as the top group goes C, G, G, up to E, right? And then after the top group plays the E, the lower group goes C, C, F, F, and then answered by C, C, E, E. And then here the two groups join up again for a few notes. I don't know of any qualified first violinist who could not actually play every single note in both parts quite beautifully. There is no real technical need to divide these up today. Perhaps there might have been back then to sort of spread the part around. But I just think that there's also a sense of coming apart at the seams in the most disciplined way. If all of these pitches are going to be played accurately by each player in each group, there still is this sense of wild abandon that is imparted to the music by this kind of scoring. Berlioz has a lot of moments in his pieces that weren't necessarily imitated because they weren't really considered to be the best practice or the most convenient thing to do. So this might be one of those. You do see trading off between divisi groups a lot in other scores, but perhaps not so much in areas where it's technically perfectly possible to play all the notes. You see the trading off more in places where two different parts come together and then they kind of go in and out of one another, or it's extremely complicated and you need to trade off between one to the other for the players to really get it under their fingers accurately. And here that's not really that much of an issue, although, maybe if you push the tempo really, really fast, much faster than is normal for this, then that might sort of be helpful, but I don't really see it, as a string player myself. I don't think that this would be all that hard for everybody to play every note in both groups. My feeling is that the purpose of this is for that sense of wild abandon, and even for the disciplined approach, you still kind of feel things coming apart. This is expressing Berlioz being torn apart by joy, right? As much as by longing. Okay, so to get out of that sort of subjective alley, let's look finally at the straight harmony here. Notice that the trumpets are just really hitting on the beats, right? They're just basically playing on 1 and then on 2. Remember, this is cut time, right? So 2 is in the middle of the bar. So they're just basically hitting the strong beats all the way through at the beginning, and then here they go to the syncopated rhythm for just a bar, and then start hitting the downbeats again. And the purpose of this, you might be wondering, well, why bother? Is so that you feel the syncopation, right? So most of the time with the trumpets, just really basically hitting that, it keeps the ear more aware of where the beat is, right? So that's just the whole purpose of that. And then, of course, just the horns just blaze out beautifully here, and especially with the stabilizing factor of the bassoons playing along with it. Okay, so what is going on here? Well, look, the bassoons are doubling the horns. Just remember your octave transposition here for C horns. And it's very simple to read your E-flat horns here, right? Just think everything is down a major sixth. So that gives you the G. This E is actually sounding G down a sixth. And then this D is sounding F down a sixth, right? So if you look at this entire screen here, the E-flat horns are basically just playing G's and F's. So you can see the benefit of having an E-flat horn in a C major piece. That really gives you the strong dominant and subdominant that you need in your harmony when you are in the tonic. And then there are other implications too when you modulate, like for instance, it gives you the strong root G when you are modulating to the 5. Once you have all of those factors all worked out, then you can just see this really beautifully balanced piece of scoring. So you've got the horns in the middle and bassoons sort of playing together with the trumpets kind of just a little bit on top of them, hitting those cardinal beats. And then inside them, not being interfered with at all, are these nice bright cornets actually playing fairly low. We often have this concept of cornets being a fairly high instrument, being almost a little shrill or brittle. But here they're just really in their element, and they're just playing that wonderful, warm, almost horn-like sound. That kind of cross between a trumpet and a horn kind of a sound. And they are working together with these middle strings right in here. And sometimes the violas are reaching much, much higher to support the clarinets and oboes in their harmony. And then, of course, you got this beautiful, brilliant melody on top, not getting too high. Then you've got this beautiful flurry of action right in here. So see, that is so simple. That is how a big page like this works. What happens on the next screen? We can see that it pretty much just continues on. There are a few little changes because the harmony is getting a little different here as we start to reach up to the B flat and so on. We throw that F sharp in there. So you can see that some things change around here in the natural parts. Some pitches are just not very tasteful on E-flat horn, so they're left out here. Notice how, like, all of the strings in both groups, all of the violins, are really reaching up here and doing the same kind of run as the timpani come in. The music really does get rather wild here. Lots of accents, lots of high pitches, lots of punching right on that syncopation by the horns on accented notes. That gives it just this big push right in the middle. And the bassoons are almost acting like horns 5 and 6. So we kind of have our extra horns right in here. Once again, we see the piccolo playing at unison with the flute as things reach higher and higher, up to A and B flat and so on. And notice that the continuity of the line is preserved. Berlioz doesn't just throw every pitch in that is below A, an octave higher, and then suddenly drop to unison in the piccolos. He really preserves the melodic curve. And then when things come back to, say, like the beginning of a phrase, he'll jump back up an octave. Especially here, playing a very weak B in the middle of the staff. It's much better to keep it at an octave right in this place. I really love this rhythmic counterpoint right in here. The triplets in the timpani, and of course stressing the middle of the bar to make this punchier and punchier. Notice that the cornets are not overdoing it. They are sort of letting go of the rest right in the middle of the beat. That actually allows the accents from the horns and the bassoons to just really jump out. It's as if this is leading into the big punch, right? The syncopation is sort of swallowing the melodic curve right in there for the middle instruments. Of course, that's not the case with our cellos, right? The cellos are just really holding on to that and making the accent part of the melody. And we have more wild abandon right in here. Continuing on with punching the middle of the bar. And here we see cellos start to work more with the double basses. So the double bass part is becoming more melodic, and the cello part is becoming more bass-like. So we have those two things working together, and it really does help to solidify this as the music just seems to want to pull itself apart a little bit. But of course, it's all an illusion. It's all quite carefully calculated. Now notice how the timpani just kind of let go as the harmony sort of gets to this one point where it's setting up the transition to the next section. And of course, the timpani was just basically playing C's and G's, right? It's a really good use of that kind of pedal harmony over which other chords can sort of climb and pull away from and come back to. So really, now that I've explained the magic trick to you of what all the functions of the music are, then it's just really easy to read this page. There's not a lot that I could point out that I have not already. There are certain things like the lovely harmonization right in here of this B-flat clarinet and other kinds of things. But suffice to say that with these big punches here from the bassoons and the horns, there's almost like a necessary clearing out of that part of the harmonic spectrum, right? So you see the cellos becoming simpler and simpler and starting to become more like bass instruments. As low as things get are really this line here in the clarinets in terms of the upper winds. And there's some passing tones here from the C trumpets, but that's a very big, loud instrument. And we have some more of that melodic doubling from the cornets. But other than that, like, there isn't a lot of stuff going on like there was before in the violas, just kind of trying to inhabit that space, and the cellos. They might as well just go to their specific roles in either supporting the bass or supporting the melody above. So just really wonderfully scored tutti. I would say something that at its time would have been considered very wild and maybe kind of operatic in a way. And then now we might think of being textbook, right? Like, this is just a really great way of scoring. And, of course, requires a lot of commitment from your string players, your violinists and violists. They're really going to have to study this, especially if the conductor wants to take it at a very fast tempo, which I've heard before in some recordings. They really want to push it and just give in to the excitement. Well, that's a little tricky for the string players. Not all that hard, really, but it just means that they're going to have to practice it and not just sight read it. So listen for all of those things. There's really kind of no point in me picking out one thing or the other after all of those explanations, but if we just backtrack here, focus on not just the melody, as I mentioned in our previous lecture, but really on what's going on in between melodic octaves, right? The harmonization, the syncopation, that just really heavy landing on the half beat here. Remember, we're in cut time, right? So 2's here, so 1.5 is right there. That kind of punch, the decorations of violins creating this sense of wildness, right? This bacchanalia of sound. And the richness of these middle voices here in the violas and cellos, along with the wonderful combination of bassoons and horns, and the trumpets landing on the cardinal beats on 1 and 2. Listen for those cornets right there on the bottom of your quadruple octave. And also listen for how the piccolo sort of eclipses right in here to not go too high when it gets to a line that leads up to A or A flat. So now you've got those functions, you've got a full explanation of this Tutti. Let's go. So you would think that that massive Tutti would resolve on a big C major chord and that would be the end of the piece, but no. In fact, there's yet another lecture to come, but before we get there, there are a couple more screens to discuss. What's wonderful is that Berlioz goes to B, or a B7 chord. It's as if he just doesn't want to resolve, right? He doesn't want to really give you a resolution that feels final, because it's not final inside him, this emotional obsession. He always keeps getting brought back to it over and over again. Going to a sort of surprise B chord, keeping in mind that things are still kind of loud here for everybody, and then there's this drawback to mezzo forte for our little repeating strings. Just a little point of notation here. What Berlioz does here is exactly the way to do it, and that is to write out a bar of measured tremolo before you notate it as measured tremolo. In fact, what I generally do is I'll write out one beam group as repeated notes, and then I'll just throw in a half note with one of these single beam lines on the stem, and then go to footballs, whole notes after that. It's going so fast, though. Keep in mind, this is cut time, and it is also saying even faster now. So it is practically unmeasured tremolo, but it should still be measured. Here you've got bassoons, staccato, and double basses pizzicato an octave lower, so they're basically playing unison octaves all the way through, even though they're written at pitch. That just has the most wonderful tiptoeing kind of a sound. It's great how, just using this, you don't really need to have cellos. You don't need a divisi staff of half of the cellos playing pizzicato in octave unison with the double basses. All you need is just to have the bassoons play staccato. Now, notice the implications of putting a staccato mark on a half note. In other writings and just in lectures, I've pointed out, I think, that you generally don't want to put a staccato mark on a longer duration unless it's at cut time. So here's an example. not just cut time, but cut time that is already going fast, practically going presto at this point. So that makes a lot of sense to put a staccato mark on a half note, and you could even have a staccato mark on a whole note if the tempo was fast enough. But we don't need to go there. As the strings hold on to this measured tremolo of this B7 chord, and then eventually modulate and so on so that things can get back to a G suspended chord, resolving to a G chord, and we'll discuss the way that this resolution is handled in a minute. Everybody else is basically tiptoeing along with the basses and bassoons, right? So all of these pitches here in the winds, in the upper winds, are essentially just the same pitches as the bassoons and double basses, just being played in a triple octave. So you've got your oboe in the middle being doubled by the first clarinet, and then an octave lower we've got the second clarinet playing the same pitch, and an octave higher we've got the flute playing the same pitch. And the piccolo is just totally not needed at this point. I just really love the way that this sort of tiptoes and gets more and more intense. Crescendo and so on. The parts become more harmonic as we get towards the end. We're throwing in trumpet right in here. This is an A-flat third, so that sort of goes along with the other things that you see in these parts. The A-flat here and the E-flat and so on. But that leads right to this beautiful, glorious G suspended chord. It's a pretty easy thing to do, to go from C to B, so you are resolving the suspension. The second violins, divisi, and you got the same thing happening here with your violas, an octave lower. And we see the pitch as well in the piccolo and the oboe, an octave lower. There's a really great relationship right in here of these two. And then, of course, just adding on to that, we have the clarinet doubling the first oboe. First clarinet and first oboe doubling. That really makes the piccolo ring out above them. Okay, but the thing that I want to point out here is that the safest thing for our natural brass to do here is to resolve to a fifth, from a second to a fifth, rather from a second to a third. Okay, that just really keeps the middle of the chord, the B, can be expressed by instruments that can just really nail the exact intonation of it. Second violins, violas, oboe and clarinet, piccolo, they're going to state that B beautifully. There's absolutely no reason for the C horns to play what might be a slightly out of tune B, and of course, like in the position in the chord, this sounding down an octave, there's really no need for it. But right in here, you could actually be doubling what's going on here in the violas, right? That would be the same exact pitch. This would be C to B. You could go C to B with your C trumpets, but the player would have to correct the B, and it might sound out of tune, right? So Berlioz is not taking any risks. He's just having them play that really solid G right in there, which is part of their natural harmonic spectrum. Of course, that G is already being underlined quite beautifully by these E-flat horns, the written E sounding G octaves down a sixth. So it all comes together quite beautifully right in here. It's just a wonderful tutti chord, and very simply done. One tiny little detail that might be worth looking at, just soft mallets right in here. Spongy baguettes. So you might think, once again, that Berlioz is going to resolve his 5 chord with a 1 chord, but no. He just hits the 5 chord again, and then the resolution comes through here as the opening of the E day fix is stated again. Right? So it resolves in pianissimo on the horns to this lovely little E third here. Ba, 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 ba. And then the clarinet comes in underneath it on this sounding G and kind of echoes an octave lower. And then the oboe comes in and states its thing. Notice that these two are really at pitch with each other. And when we get to this E flat, he's really sort of trending the harmony away from C major once again. So much so that the bassoons come in on an F, right? And so on. We won't get into the harmony here. It's pretty simple. You can work it out yourself. But I just really love the fact that we were tiptoeing towards this beautiful tutti, and then everything pulls back and it becomes lovely wind ensemble scoring with a little help from horns. And notice his little irregular heartbeat is being stated down here. Just such a lovely idea, and I don't think anybody has really imitated that so much, except maybe in parody. But just the whole idea of the staccato descending double basses stating a heartbeat. Such a lovely idea, so powerful. Okay, so past this screen, as you'll hear when I play this for you in a few minutes, you will notice that it just basically goes back to what was on this first screen. And there are a couple little differences that I'll talk about in the next lecture, but I figured that this is a pretty good place to stop. A couple of screens after that big explanation of the tutti that we had at the beginning of the lecture, I think is good enough. And then we'll wrap up the final massive tutti passage where he just really drives home his point, then comes around to a concluding point, and then has a little coda at the end that ends quite religiously, literally, in terms of harmony. So we'll study all of that in the next lecture, but let's just wrap it up now. So listen for all of those things, the clarinet and the oboe kind of stepping on each other's toes here. This is sounding G, and the oboe comes in sounding G right on top of it. And because, not just because they pull apart here, but because the oboe has such a different quality of sound from the clarinet, it's very clear. And just the lovely modulation here. It's just exceptional. I just really love the scoring right in here. Listen for your little heartbeats right in here. And just the tricky way that Berlioz does not resolve things on the downbeat in the beginning of the next passage, but he resolves in context of pulling back. Just so lovely. And then on this previous screen, listen for the kind of obvious stuff, the tiptoeing from the octaves in bassoons and double basses. Listen for that quality of the bassoons on top in unison and the double basses an octave lower, playing pizzicato together. And then just bouncing off of the upper winds right in here as the strings sort of play their little measured tremolo and get more and more frantic as they push towards here. Listen for the entrance of the trumpet and cornet right in here. And then you've got this lovely suspension and resolution going on here. I mean, of course, not a resolution in terms of the cadence, but just resolving from a suspended to just a regular major chord. You might even be able to hear the way that this pitch drops down a fourth, the C to the G, in both of these parts, octaves apart, while the other instruments resolve from C to B. Just much, much easier on fully chromatic instruments. Listen for all of those things. We're getting towards the end of this movement, and just like this really pushes at the whole tempo of things, I can feel the whole tempo of this first section of these lectures accelerating. So very exciting to talk to you about all of this, and I hope that you are enjoying this as much as me, because I'm really having a fun time here. I really feel that this orchestration is so original. In its day, there was just nothing like it. There was nothing of this scope. If he used techniques that had come before him, he expanded them vastly. And in many instances, he did things that really were unusual and striking, like pizzicato doubled by bassoons above at the octave in staccato. I think that there had been doubling at pitch of cellos and double basses, but I think that this is something you can possibly credit to Berlioz of doing first. I don't know, of course somebody will go and look it up and they'll find it in Weber now, right? But there are a lot of things that just really feel like the first time they were done, and maybe if they aren't exactly, it's the context in which they appear that is so original and striking. So have a listen to this, and I will see you in the next lecture for the final part of Movement 1 of Symphonie Fantastique, but not the final lecture. There will be 4 more movements to go, each one unique in its own way and definitely worth discussing in detail. See you then.